the oppressed. You and I are lobbyists for the afflicted.
What does the Lord require? That you do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God.
Welcome, everybody, to this next edition of the Black Faith, Black Power podcast. This is Bishop Dwayne Royster, Executive Director of Power Interfaith, Senior Pastor of the Faith United Church of Christ out of Washington, D.C., and also the founder of the Society for Faith and Justice, an ecumenical religious order committed to a charism of social justice as spiritual discipline and spiritual practice. I'm glad to be back here with you today to continue our conversation about building Black faith and building Black power that, I like to say, changes the damn world. Because at the end of the day, if we're not changing the world, then we're leaving people right where they are, and we don't want to do that. I'm real excited that friend and colleague is here today. He pastors the fastest growing church in Philadelphia, Dare to Imagine, up in the northwest section of the city in Mount Airy, just a few blocks from where I grew up. And I'm always glad to have the Reverend Dr. Kevin R. Johnson in the house and to be able to spend some time with him today. Let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Johnson. So he is a graduate of the House, Morehouse College and University down in Atlanta, Georgia. He's a proud graduate of Lincoln Union Seminary in New York City, which is one of the Ivy Leagues. You don't really have Ivy Leagues for the seminary, but Union's really, literally, if you ever seen it, the building that it's in looks like an Ivy League kind of place. Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And he also has a doctorate of education from Columbia University Teachers College as well. Brother's well educated, well trained, well prepared for the work. Again, he's a senior pastor of Dare to Imagine congregation here in Philly. And he's also the former president of Philadelphia OIC and was really instrumental in doing some great work in terms of workforce development and creating opportunities, in particular for young folk to get into the workforce in good paying jobs with benefits. And so we are excited that you're here. He's happily married to Kimya Johnson, a very dynamic counselor, lawyer. Actually, when I was on council in Norristown, she was one of our lawyers for the whole municipality. And so appreciate that. And he's got 3 kids, including his son, who is following his daddy's footsteps at Morehouse College right now. So Dr. Kevin Johnson, thank you for being here with us today. How are you doing, my brother?
I'm doing well, Bishop, and thank you so much for having me. I really thank God for you. And I just have to share with everybody that there would probably not be a Dare to Imagine if it were not for God, if it were not for the people, and if it were not for the counsel of Bishop Dwayne Royster. He gave me some good, solid advice that has yielded much fruit. So, brother, I love you. I appreciate you. And I will always give you credit for the seeds that you planted and the advice that you gave me that helped to really give birth to Dare to Imagine.
Well, brother, I'm just excited to be able to watch what God did with you and those seeds and grew that church called Dare to Imagine. It's a fantastic congregation. And so, wow, just really, really blessed. It's your leadership that helped it to grow and do whatever it did. I just wanted to give some words of encouragement, man. I just wanted to be a Barnabas to you in that moment. I just want to be Barnabas. That's all it was. And I'm excited to see everything that you're doing. Well, hey, today we're recording this, and this actually won't play for a couple of weeks, but this is the day that we're commemorating. It's the 1-year anniversary of the death of George Floyd.
Yes.
And, it's a hard day, but also in some ways, for many folk, it's like, but we got some accountability in this particular case, right? Just because of the egregiousness of the whole situation.
Yeah.
But part of the question that we're wrestling with in George Floyd, in this particular moment in human history where we're dealing with white supremacy and white privilege and white nationalism and white Christian nationalism, is the question about, a lot of people are asking about the relevance of the Black church right now. Is it relevant? Is it really standing up in this moment? Is it really doing what it needs to do? And I mean, you've served some of the most powerful churches in this country, including up in New York. And forgive me, the name of the congregation wasn't Canaan.
Abyssinian Baptist Church.
Abyssinian. You were at Abyssinian Baptist Church, right? World-renowned congregation.
Yeah.
What is the in your estimation in this moment, what is the role of Black faith in building Black power right now?
Yeah, the role of Black faith and building Black power is, unfortunately, Bishop, is what it always has been. We are the voice, and in many cases, we are the only voice that people will be able to hear and that power structures will listen to. And I think what the George Floyd, I guess we think about the anniversary of his unfortunate death, is that it's a reminder that we would not have seen a Derek Chauvin arrested or even convicted if it were not for the voice of the Black church. And what I'm excited about right now is, even though it may not be in the traditional forms and what the ways in which we've been able to see it, but you see the work of power and the work that they're doing. You see the work of Black Lives Matter. And you see what I call street prophets.
Right.
Now, they may not have gone to and spent a lot of money going to school like you and me, but they are street prophets, and their voice is just as powerful as those who have been ordained by God. And I think that as I look at what makes me so excited is because unfortunately, the church over these past, I probably would say that the last 20 or so years has become so silent, has become so focused on the prosperity gospel that they have not been prophetic. And what really encourages me is to see these street prophets. And I think about here last summer in Philadelphia and how there were so many different marches taking place. And at one hand, it was like, okay, who's leading this? But on the other hand, that's exactly what we needed. Because when you look at Martin Luther King Jr., you look at Malcolm X, that they killed the leader. And to some degree, in 1968 with Dr. King, it almost killed the movement.
That's right.
And when you have a number of leaders, therefore, the movement will continue to move forward. So I'm excited about seeing the voices that are rising up, but also I want to make sure that the Black church is still out there in the forefront. And that's why I'm going to continue to make sure my voice is heard and be helpful, not only in speaking out, but also trying to make sure there's a new generation of leaders who are rising up as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the street prophets. I mean, that's one of the reasons I founded the Society for Faith and Justice, because of this deep concern about the fact that we have schools that create chaplains and priests. But where is the space that we're resourcing the prophets?
That's right.
And the prophets tend to be isolated, right? They don't often travel in big packs, right? If you go back to the Hebrew Bible, the prophets there pretty much were like one or two of them at a time that were doing their work. And so I think that is that's an important piece about how we need to move and things, how things are moving forward in this particular moment. So I mean, you're from Texas originally.
Yeah.
You were in church down there. I mean, you were in the South. You grew up in the South. Let's just be, or the great nation of Texas, right? We should call it the United States of Texas.
Right.
How did that shape you for this moment? I mean, just a few months ago, you were doing a whole sermon series in your congregation about white supremacy and about white nationalism, which, let's be honest, 10 years ago, no church was doing a sermon series on white supremacy, right? So tell me, what got you prepared for that moment to be able to speak that truth to your people that could also help to shape and offer, as I hear Jeremiah Wright, the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright say all the time, have a hermeneutic of suspicion about both what we're hearing and also what we're reading.
Yeah, a lot of it just had to do with the political climate, and really there's still the political climate that is here. That time it was, we had COVID 45, Donald Trump, he was the president of the United States, and also just seeing the overreaction and the abuse of power of police. And the movie 13th, really, I watched a documentary with my family, and obviously, about, white nationalism, white Christianity and white power, but I really hadn't connected all of them together until I read Robert P. Jones's book. about white Christianity and white nationalism. And it was at that moment that I went back and started to piece this together. And I said, we really need to share with our people how white supremacy and white nationalism has had its roots in the early days of Christianity here in America. Now, we know that when you look at the faith and you look at Christianity, it does not begin in Europe. It does not begin in America. It begins it has seeds in Africa. So I could go through a whole Bible study on that. But when you look at how this country was founded, it was really because of the Catholic Church. We don't like to talk about the papal bulls. We don't like to talk about the explorations. But the reason why the explorations, and you look at the manifest destiny, it is because they firmly believe that the church was sending them out, kind of like in the Bible about going to the promised land. And it was that notion and that belief that led to the slaughter of Native Americans, that led to the African slave trade. Now, of course, we can have a whole debate about what happened with the African slave trade, but the reality is demonizing and looking at other people as the other, and that they were inhuman, that you could treat them like property and cattle. All of that had its early seeds in Christianity. And then when you start to piece things together and you see how the church reinforced that here in America, and how when you look at the AME church and how Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and how they had to start because they were denied to pray in the church.
That's right.
So many roots, and I could just keep going on and on. And then when you look at law enforcement and its tying to the KKK and you look at the political structures, I really wanted people to understand that a lot of it was rooted right there in the church. The Southern Baptist Convention was started on racism. And so all of those threads are there. And even with these mega churches right now, and I learned a lot from them, how they have started their churches, but the seeds of racism are still there. And that's what's playing out in America. And if we don't speak truth to power, if we don't address the issues of white Christianity and white nationalism and how they're at the bedrock of this country, then we'll continue to see Proud Boys popping up and trying to move forward with a philosophy and an ideology that they are trying to say is a theology, but it's not. It's actually racism in its purest form.
So in this particular moment, and thank you for that. I mean, that's very powerful. But in this moment, so part of the challenge that we have is, you and I both have gone to higher education institutions to be trained in Christian theology, right? And Christian understanding and, pastoral care and everything else. And, if we were to be really honest, right, it's framed in a European culture. It's not framed for African-American culture, right? Or African culture in general. Matter of fact, when we went to church history, right, there's a little bit of talk about, Egypt and Ethiopia, and then it quickly moves to Europe, right? And then we don't ever go back to Africa again, except when people are sort of like, oh, and then in the 1900s, we started sending missionaries there. And I'm like, that was the place where Christianity really was birthed. So, we're trained in this. So what in your estimation is we have to be, some people would say decolonized in our theological understanding. What is the role of the Black church in teaching this right now? I mean, you led the way. I have not seen any other pastor, and especially of a church the size of yours, doing teaching like this. So what's the role of the Black church in terms of building Black power right now and doing that decolonization of our theology?
Yeah, so the church has to frame this in such a way that we see the seeds of this and we're able to identify it. Now, what I did at Dare to Imagine, I turned into a Bible study. And, of course, all of us have an ego. I was disappointed I didn't get the views that I thought that it should have gotten, because I thought it was a very important subject. But what I learned is that the people who tuned in, they took what I said and they began to spread the message and say, look, you need to read this book by Robert P. Jones that talks about white Christianity and white nationalism here and white supremacy in America. And it has to take place not just in Bible study, it has to take place on Sunday mornings in preaching. And it also has to take place as we interact with our young people, because many of them, they're not able to make the connections that we're able to make. And I'm a student of history, and I believe that if you do not know your history, that you are bound to repeat it. And that's why I taught the Bible study. That's why I preached about it. That is why we make sure that the voices are out there. And, another thing from a practical way, what we did was, as the march that Reverend Sharpton had there in DC in August of 2020, we took down 2 buses down there. And so it was also not just hearing me preach about it, not just hearing me talk about it, but also seeing us there on the streets, not only in DC, but we even had some things that we did here in Philadelphia, because we want folk to understand that if we do not address these racist, political power structures, and even religious racist structures, that we are bound to repeat ourselves.
Wow. Wow, that's actually really powerful. And one of the things I appreciate is that you got your folk in the pews in the streets, right?
Yep.
Because I think a lot of times, a lot of clergy get out, it's them, but then their folk are like nowhere to be found for that. And so, what was it like for you actually mobilizing your congregation to participate both in the August 28th action down in Washington, D.C., and also other activities in the city of Philadelphia, especially during COVID?
It's interesting, and I just want to kind of share this with you. And it's interesting that we're having this conversation today, because dare to imagine that I am actually featured today in the Wall Street Journal.
Okay, great.
The article is called "On the Anniversary of George Floyd's Killing: The Debate About Race Reaches Across American Life." And the gentleman who's one of the authors, Joshua Jamerson, he did an article earlier in September, and he featured us, and they captured the church being down there and how we had brought people to the march. And on the anniversary of George Floyd, they wanted to do another kind of piece. And as I shared with him, as I thought about the march, is that it was in the midst of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I had to really pray about, do we do it? Do people drive down their own cars? Should we do buses? And then there was the other question is, what if we don't go?
Wow.
And we just kind of weighed the risk. And I said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do it in a safe way. And we didn't fill the entire bus because we had people spaced out. We had temperature checks. You had to wear masks the entire time. Nobody got COVID. Everybody got down there safely. And when we arrived there on the mall, there were so many people who were there, and so many of my members and even folk from the community who got on the bus with us, they were thankful that we took people down there, even in the midst of COVID, because we were sent to, even in a pandemic, there's a bigger pandemic, and it's the pandemic of racism.
Wow. Could you tell us more about what you talked about in the article? That would love to hear more about what you were saying there.
Yes, in the article, they were really focused on, how churches are dealing with race, and what I said that, even before the protests was even on my mind. What I have seen over really the past year in America is that there are really 2 Americas. There's the old racist America that we thought was dormant, but now we're starting to realize that this America is very much alive. And that's why I was sharing with them in the article about how we had gone about making sure that we had taught and trained people as it related to race in this country, white supremacy in this country, how white Christianity is founded upon racism. And I wanted to help people to understand that the seeds of this, unfortunately, has a lot of roots in the Christian church. I mean, I know that Andy Stanley is having these racial reconciliation Bible studies, and I've talked to people who are members of his church in Atlanta. And what they have said to me is that it has actually turned them further away from the white evangelical church, because they are now starting to see how racist some of those people are. I think that in this day and age in which we live, it's very important for us to keep these conversations going. And I'm pretty sure in your work, even as we deal with issues that are related to our community, as we look at other communities, what we are dealing with, they're dealing with as well. And it always, to me, racism boils down to the fundamental issue of that you view somebody else as the other versus your brother and sister. Because if we firmly saw the other person as our brother or sister, then we would not look at them as this other thing. And when you look at someone as the other, then you would treat that person however you want to treat them, because again, they're not you, they're not human.
Right.
And that's what white Christianity did, is that it tried to dehumanize us as that we're not children of God when all of us are children of God.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wow. And thank you for sharing that about what's happening with Andy Staley down in Atlanta and those studies. I mean, I think that that's important, because what we've experienced over the last four years prior to January 20th was American white evangelicalism that was more committed to white supremacy than it was the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're going to be real, right? It was,
Yeah.
and it probably has always been that way, but it just really came to fruition in that moment. And we have to call it out for what it is. And I appreciate that, sometimes we have to even prophesy to the people in our own faith, to get them back on track, right? It doesn't mean that just because you say you follow Jesus doesn't mean you're always staying right on the right path.
That's
Sometimes you got to get called back to it as well. So let me, I'm gonna ask you to do something here, because the name of your church is Dare to Imagine. So I want you to imagine the powerful prophetic Black church into the 21st century. What does that look like to you?
Wow. You just gave me a canvas now. So I
paint it, brother, paint it.
Yeah. I see the Black church, prophetic church of the future, as a church that understands what James Cone talked about, is that we need to be in sync with God of the oppressed. And I remember being a student at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and Dr. Cone's, book, obviously, read through it, and Black Liberation and Black Power, et cetera. But that book spoke to me because he made a strong theological argument, and it's backed up in the scripture, that God is always on the side of the oppressed. And I think that if we let that, I'm from Texas, so Louisiana is next door to us. And for those who know anything about gumbo, what makes gumbo good gumbo is the roux. If we let the theology of God of the oppressed be our roux, then we will always be deeply rooted in the prophetic social justice movement, because God is always going to be on the side of the oppressed. And as long as there is capitalism, we must be speaking for the voiceless. As long, and I'm not against it, because I live in America, but I'm also very much aware of how people have used capitalism so that they can enrich themselves while they don't, in your words, don't give a damn about everybody else.
Right.
You're rubbing off on me now. But I'm serious about this, because we must always be thinking about the least of these. We must always have a Matthew 25 understanding of the scripture. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was without shelter, did you provide me shelter? And the moment the church loses that understanding that they are representing the oppressed, that's the moment the church dies.
So one of the things that you are doing in your church is preparing a whole nother generation of leaders to come along, of ministers, of deacons, of lay folk. What are you saying to them in this moment?
Yeah, I am saying to them that don't ever become at ease in Zion. And one of the things that we really had to fight against moving to where we are in this middle class neighborhood in Mount Airy is that we could have been like, we don't have to deal with those West Philadelphia problems anymore. We don't have to deal with those North Philadelphia problems anymore. And what I have tried to do with this ministry, while it is very middle class, is to remind them that we have an obligation to keep reaching back and to bring somebody else with us. And that to me is what has led to, and I was talking with Jennifer Jones Austin, the late Bill Jones's daughter from Bethany Baptist Church in Brooklyn. And she and I were talking because his book, God of the Ghetto, she has just published out and republished for her father, in memory of her father. And we were just talking about the social gospel movement. And what she was saying is that, you know, through some different things that we're doing with how we show impact, how we're blessing people, she was like, that's social gospel. She was like, that is the God of the ghetto. That's what James Cone was talking about, God of the oppressed. And for me, trying to infuse that into what we do is so important, because so many of the young people, they can get caught up in TikTok and they get caught up in social media. And really social media, Instagram, Facebook, it's all about me. And what we have tried to do is to say, what are we doing about them? Because as long as we keep our focus on them and being a blessing to others, then we'll still be able to keep God's word alive and keep it prophetic.
Well, I mean, I'm going to talk about this. I know we didn't talk about, we were going to talk about this, but during COVID, you started blessing smaller congregations to be able to do their ministry with social media. Could you talk more about that and what you did with that?
Yeah, when COVID hit, you know, everybody was hit by this in March of 2020. We were blessed to have the technology. And my heart really went out because I love pastors. I know the struggle of what it's like to start something from the ground up. I also know what it's like to take over a traditional church. And what I wanted to do, and God really placed on my heart, to help 10 churches by giving them $1,000 each. And then we end up raising $20,000. And then we just kept the initiative going for the entire year.
Wow.
But I did not want the churches to not be able to hear from their pastors. I did not want for there to be any reason for people to be cut off from their church community. And that's why we gave away these 1,000, sometimes 2,000, sometimes 5,000 technology grants, is to help churches get the technology that they need. And to be quite honest with you, we're not done yet. I mean, we're now looking at how can we, I'm doing workshops now with different churches and really helping them understand how they can use technology, not only to minister to their congregations, but also to make sure that their voices are still heard. Because COVID is not going anywhere. The world has changed. Church is never going to be what it once was. It is, as I told my team the other day, I said there was an R&B prophet by the name of James Brown who informs us today. And he simply said, give the people what they want. And that's the season that we're in right now, is that really now the worshiper controls how they receive now their spiritual content. And the church has to adjust to those different ways so we can best meet them where they are.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the powerful thing in this particular moment, because of social media and other vehicles, it almost democratizes the gospel in some sense, right? It makes it much more accessible to the people. And, you know, one of the things that I've learned, because I watched this happen during the week, you know, we do a Sunday worship, you know, we put it out on social media. And, you know, by the end of the day, you have a certain number of hits, people that watched it. But then as you watch the week go along, people are actually coming back, listening to the sermons, listening to the worship experience, commenting and giving, right? Sometimes they're giving too in the middle of the week. And you're like, where does this come from? You know, and so it actually gives people more accessibility to the message. You know, and in many circumstances, I know for yourself and others, there are prophetic messages that they need at different points and different times. So what a wonderful gift that you gave to those congregations to be able to help support them in their ministry and continue to share the good news.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for highlighting that.
No, I was really impressed by that. And I mean, especially in a time when a lot of people were worried about austerity, you chose not to go in the direction of austerity, but chose to be a blessing. And I think that that's very powerful. And that actually needs to be a part of what it means to be prophetic in this age, right? It's I always go back to Acts 2, it's not Acts 2, Acts 4, where it talks about the fact that when the disciples were struggling in that particular moment because of the persecution, they all gathered together and they shared everything that they had, right?
That's right. That's
And
right.
so that everybody had what they needed in that particular crisis that they were experiencing in their faith and in their community. And in this particular moment, we're facing a common crisis. And instead of saying, "Oh my God, we've got to hold all of our own," you said,
Right.
"Nope, we're going to give out." That's prophetic too. And I think that
Yeah,
that shows the power of the Black church.
no, thanks for that. And what it did is that it was really an exercise of faith for us, because we did not have the resources when we first did it. But I kid you not, every time we gave away money, we received money to replace that money that was given out.
Wow.
And it just made it easy to keep giving it out. So I want to thank, Dare to Imagine and so many others who have, partnered with us, because I was just trying to merely be obedient to what the Lord said. And that spurred us not only helping churches, but helping Black businesses, helping nonprofits, helping individuals. And so I'm very glad of the work that we have done. And but it really started just because of trying to be a blessing to others.
Let me ask you this one final question and we'll get ready to go. And I appreciate you taking so much
Yeah, no
time with us
problem.
today to be a part of the podcast. As if you were talking to colleagues right now and folk that were like, I don't know this political thing. I don't know if I can really throw down. I can't really get there. I don't know if this is tuned to the gospel or not.
Right.
And I'm probably sure you've had some of those conversations with folk,
Yeah.
right? What would you say to them to say, to convince them, like, you've got to throw down in this work right now to be relevant and to do the gospel?
Yeah, I think right now, this is a blessing. This is one of the blessings of, and as tragic as it is, but George Floyd reminded us that incident that we can no longer ignore it.
Mm.
And it had sparked such a fuse. To me, George Floyd was similar to what happened in Egypt that led to the whole unrest over there. I was kind of like an autumn spring.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think that what George Floyd's death did was it had awakened this sleeping giant.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when people saw him saying, "I can't breathe," and they saw him calling out for his mother, that ignited something, because it said to people that could be me too.
Yeah.
And what I hope happens with these moments is that they just don't become, and I preached about this, is this going to become a moment or a movement? Because a moment is just something you do right now because it's popular. But a movement is what we're talking about.
Right.
And so many times power structures, and particularly white supremacy, they're used to us getting caught up in the moment. But if we want this to be sustaining, and if we really want to bring down the shackles of white supremacy and white privilege, then it is going to require for us to really turn this into a movement. And it's easy when they create these chief diversity officers at these corporations. I see it all the time. But yet the board, and yet the CEOs, and yet the people who own the stock, that they are still white. We still have a long ways to go. And so for me, yes, Derek Chauvin being convicted was great. But for me, the real change is going to be when I start seeing Black home ownership go up, when I start seeing Black investment go up, when I start seeing private equity firms that are investing in Black businesses so that they can become profitable. The real change is going to be when I start seeing school grades and SAT scores going up because there are more resources that are coming into the school. And the real change is going to be when I start seeing our community understanding that just because you have arrived does not mean that we have arrived. And so we have a lot of work to do. I'm committed not to the moment, but to the movement. And I'm glad to be partnering with you, brother.
Wow. Reverend Dr. Kevin R. Johnson, Senior Pastor of the Dare to Imagine Church. Wow, thank you for being a part of the Black Faith, Black Power podcast today. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to share with us. And I hope that we'll have you back and have more conversations in the future as we continue to build power to be able to change the damn world. Because honestly, there are too many people waking up every morning feeling like they're living in hell. And we've got to fight that. So appreciate you, sir. And we'll be back in touch with you soon.
Thank you.
All right. Blessings.
Thank you for listening to Black Faith, Black Power, produced by Power Interfaith.